Your voice, your opinion, your community. Fact TV, free speech protected.
Hello and welcome to the New Commons. I'm Johanna Laurie, and with me today is my guest Harry Bub. Let me tell you a little bit about Harry. Harry is a retired graphic artist who has lived in this area for over 25 years, and he's been actively involved locally in the 9/11 Truth Movement, the anti-war movement. And what he does in retirement is quite a lot. He is a gifted artist, a writer, and a researcher who has written and published a number of limited edition books on such diverse subjects as poetry, short stories, photography, and current events. His most recent work is a 350-page digital book on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which is called Killing JFK. He is presently working on a current affairs book called Gaza, A Journey to the Dark Side. I've known Harry since 2010, and I greatly value his friendship and commitment to the creation of a peaceful and just world for everyone. Harry is, as I know him, a tireless truth seeker. He and I are going to talk today about Gaza, starting with the historical background for the current conflict, or how Israel became a country and the challenges it has faced ever since. Welcome, Harry.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna.
So the first thing I really need to ask you, Harry, which intrigued me, was, so why did you decide to write a book about Gaza?
Well, part of the reason why is Jim Smart.
Was it?
Jim is the one who got me started in 9/11, and he also was one of the ones who got me started into Israel and Palestine. And, the guy has been tireless in his pursuit of truth and justice. And but what really moved me recently to do Gaza was the obvious murders, mass murder going on in Gaza.
Right now, right? Yeah.
You have to be blind not to see what's going on, and so I thought this would be a good thing for one of my books, and so far it's going along pretty good. It's a lot of work, but
that's a way then of processing also your feelings about this, because we all have, understandably, just incredible feelings about all this, and it's very hard to see this happening.
Yeah,
and we don't want to feel hopeless about it. We want to feel like there are things we can do
absolutely
that make a difference. Yeah.
Well, for me, it's an educational experience. I find that writing books forces me to research, and I tend to research with 6, 10, 20, 50 books on a subject. And so eventually I get to figure out what's going on, and then feel confident to write a book. Mm-hmm. And right now, the most important thing for all of us to remember is that October 7th was not the beginning of the problem. Mm-hmm. The problem began 75 years ago or thereabouts with the idea in 1894 to 1897, the bunch of Eastern European Jews got together and decided that the Jews needed a homeland, someplace safe and secure. And so they looked around the world, and they checked out a number of places, and they decided that they would want to go back to Israel, where they had Palestine, where they had a homeland, ancient homeland, over 1,000 years ago. Well, the problem was that Palestine was occupied and it had been occupied for 700 years or so by Muslims, by Arabs, by the Palestinian people. And the Zionists knew this, but they didn't care. They knew they would find a way.
So that now this, what for people who don't know, was Zionist what they invented to call themselves, or is that what other people have called them?
I think that was something that they
Right.
constructed for themselves.
And it refers to, Zion refers to the place their religion comes from. Is
Right.
that right? This is what this refers to.
Right.
So what they're looking at in a way is a religious homecoming, shall we say?
Right.
Right. Because this is the place where where Judaism originally got its beginnings, and its early history its biblical history is all wrapped up in what we have called by various names. We've called the Holy Land. We've called
Right.
the Levant.
Israel, whatever you call it, it's
yeah.
And they. But the thing of it is that they decided that they were going to do this in spite of the fact that somebody else is living there. Now, this is the height of arrogance, and this is the cause. The cause for the last 15 wars that the Arab and Israelis have fought. The cause is the fact that they stole the land from the Palestinians.
Well, let's give what their reasoning about this is, because as you say, there's two sides to this story.
Right.
On the one hand, there are the Palestinians who were kicked out and murdered, and this all happened at the beginning and is still happening. And their co-religionists among Muslim nations who don't want to see this happen. But then the people who became Israelis have reasoning, and what is it their claims to?
Well,
this
here's the Israeli claims to ownership of Palestine, and there are three basic claims: the legacy of the Old Testament and the Bible, the Balfour Declaration, which was issued by Great Britain in 1917, and the partition of Palestine into two Arab and Jewish states recommended by the UN in 1947. And if we consider each one of those claims independently, we see that historically Jews were not the first inhabitants of Palestine, nor had they lived there as long as other people had lived there. In sum, the ancient Jews controlled Palestine on major parts for less than 600 years in the 5,000-year history of Palestine. The Palestinians lived there continuously for 600 to 700 years.
So that was quite long ago.
Right.
So their idea that then, based on early inhabitants of that area, that they could then come back and resume, if you say, their.
Yeah. It's a foolish idea. It equates to the idea that if you have a home and you have your home and you decide to sell it, and then you come back 20 years later and you say, hey, I want my house back, the guy who lives there is not going to be interested in giving it back to you. And even if you take it, as the Israelis did take the Palestinian land, it's not morally right, and it can
or
cause
legally
problems.
Justified. Or legally
Yeah,
justified.
it's not justified.
Well, and when you think of the history of people, as long as we've been here,
Right.
people have been taking other people's lands and trying to justify it in various
Right.
ways. But and in the 20th century, in the 21st century, we try to make sure that everything is indeed legal.
Theoretically.
But but that too doesn't always hold water. So so
The Balfour Declaration was a document from the cabinet of the British government, which said, in effect, We like the idea of a Palestinian homeland. We'll support that idea. And the problem was with that, number one, it was still morally wrong. It was also the fact that they didn't own the land. They had no claim to the land. This was 1917 during the war, and the only reason why they did it was because it was politically correct for the moment. And 1920, the Balfour Declaration was rescinded. Nobody seemed, the Zionists don't want to mention that, but it was never a legal document of any kind.
I think the other thing to say about the Balfour Declaration is that the fact that it was issued during and before the end of the First World War,
Right.
and that Great Britain and France were very eager, actually I'm sure Germany too, all the countries fighting in that war were very eager to get out of it. That war started in 1914, and they said they all thought it was going to be over in a few months.
Right.
It lasted for 4 years, and horrendous number of people killed on all sides. And so the devastation was terrible, and everyone was ready to get out of that. And the fact that Britain could have lasted so long before we entered the war, we finally tipped the balance,
Well,
and we've been sitting on the sidelines for years, but was that they had wealthy Jews who were part of this Zionist movement who were actually supporting the British government. So the British government was getting a lot of money and felt like it really did owe these people something, So,
Well, it's also
Yeah.
the Harry Truman. The only reason why Harry Truman was elected in 1948 was because of the Jewish financial support, and this was the reason why he supported the 1947 General Assembly Bill 181, which advised that Palestine be divided up. Well, of course, after he was elected, they did the recommendation from the General Assembly was not binding. It was not legally binding. It needed the Security Council
to have said,
to Security Council to follow through and make it happen. So in effect, the General Assembly Referendum 181 was not legally binding. It did not do anything legal. What happened afterwards was that the Israelis went over. They were Zionists then, but anyhow, they went out onto the land that was partitioned to them, and took the land. And then they went over and took 25% of the land that was supposed to be assigned to the Palestinians, and then the war became obvious between the Arabs and the Israelis.
Let me just say,
Go ahead.
I just want to go back to the Balfour Declaration for a minute,
Right.
because what they said in that, in 1917 was, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being certainly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and domestic status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So on paper at least, they supported the idea from 1917 onward that there would be some kind of a just division of that small area between Jews on the one hand and Arabs on the other. But then, in actual fact, there was a predisposition to support the Jews more than the Arabs from the beginning, and this is what you see when you get to the establishment of the UN, because this rather, it was ended up being a toothless kind of recommendation, really, because it wasn't a law. They recommended that we have these two states side by side, and that they're going to be treated equally. And also you have to think that who was there before, and the number of people at the time that they set up the state of Israel. We have some figures on that, don't we, as to how many Arabs there were, how many Jews, how many Christians, because Arabs, Jews, and Christians had all existed rather peacefully side by side ever since, for quite a long time there, until this new settlement came in. So.
At the time of the Balfour Declaration, the Palestinians had been there for approximately 730 years. They had a population of 600,000, while only 60,000 were Jews. And by 1947, the Jewish ownership in the land was a mere 6.59% of the total. In other words, they didn't own anything. They had not. There was a very small population, and we ended up. The UN ended up giving them more than half of the of Palestine. Now, it's not only that we gave them more than half; there was no compensation involved. Now, when you take something from somebody, you expect that there'd be some sort of compensation, and it wasn't an even swap.
No, and I wanted just to also make clear that sad as this is, the Zionists were quite aware of what they were doing, because they had already said, and I want to give some quotes here of what people were saying before they actually set up the State of Israel. So, for instance, in 1938, David Ben-Gurion gave a speech in which he said, "After we become a strong force, we shall abolish partition and expand to the whole of Palestine. The state will have to preserve order, not by preaching, but with machine guns." And they laid out this plan called Plan Dalet. Was that at that time? Because it sounds like this was part of that was already being envisioned in 1938.
Plan Dalet was right around 1940.
Around 1940.
1947.
But just before. So it was before.
Yes.
Before the part.
The war actually began. In 1947, November 1947 was when the 181 was passed.
Well, in 1940, a Zionist by the name of Joseph Weitz said, "It must be clear that there is no room in the country for both peoples. If the Arabs leave it, the country will become wide and spacious for us. The only solution is a land without Arabs. There is no room here for compromises. There is no way but to transfer the Arabs from here to the neighboring countries. Not one village must be left, not one tribe. There is no other solution." And that's before this action. So you can see they had in mind that this division into two parts wasn't going to last very long.
Right. Well, it's also they were going to take all of it. Number one, they were going to take all of it. And number two, there was not going to be any Arabs in it.
Yeah.
As few as possible.
So then what actually happened, I believe, did the fighting start before the declaration of the State of Israel in 1948? It started before.
Right.
There was already fighting, and then when they declared that, several of the neighboring countries got involved, right? To begin with, the Zionists had terrorist groups that the Irgun and the Stern Gang were a couple of the terrorist groups. Menachem Begin was a leader of the, which one, I forget which one, quite frankly. One of the groups Menachem Begin was involved in, they did the explosion at the King David Hotel in Cairo, which killed 172 people or something in that nature. They also assassinated a UN representative, Count Bernadotte, and he was famous for saving Jews during World War II, and he was there to kind of help negotiate between the Arabs and the Israelis, and the Irgun were worried that he might be able to come up with a peace plan that they didn't like, so they assassinated
this UN representative. So the war actually began before 1948.
But this actual taking of the Palestinian villages, did that start then in the?
Yeah, they were always doing that. They were always fighting within Palestine. They had been fighting for probably 10 or 20 years before 1948. And
well, the other quote that I have, that I think is very telling, is about this Plan Dalet,
Right.
which you said dates to 1948, does it?
Late 47, 48.
Okay. And as I quote here, the orders came with a detailed description of the methods to be used to forcibly evict the people, large-scale intimidation, laying siege to and bombarding villages and population centers, setting fire to homes, properties, and goods, expelling residents, demolishing homes, and finally planting mines in the rubble to prevent the expelled inhabitants from returning. And this article notes that when this expulsion of the Palestinians during that period was over, more than half of Palestinians' indigenous population, over 750,000 people, had been uprooted, 531 villages had been destroyed, and an estimated 10 to 15,000 Palestinians were dead. So that was a major shift in that region right then that happened, just all of a sudden. And this, understandably, the Palestinians didn't want to have this happen. In fact, I remember reading in one place that the new Israelis were kind of miffed that the Palestinians didn't fight back.
Yes, that was.
And they didn't, because they'd been there and they just felt like this was our home.
They were going to ride it out.
Yeah, they were going to sit there.
They had been taken over in the 700 some years that they had existed in Palestine. They had been taken over by a number of different groups, and the inhabitants got used to being taken over, and basically things didn't change all that much for them. So they
took the
were
long view.
They were reluctant to fight back against the Israelis, and the Israelis were, like you say, they were frustrated because they couldn't get him to leave, and they knew that they had to get him to leave.
But
so
then
that's where the massacres came in.
Right, but they also, when they finally did just actually pick them up and transport them, the Palestinians still felt somehow we're going to get back to our villages.
Right.
So this is what the whole idea of return, that they to this day, Palestinians feel there's going to be a time when they'll be able to return to their lands.
Well, that's one of the most important points of contention, is that the quote unquote right of return. These people who were expelled went to Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Egypt. They were destitute. They were in tents, in refugee camps.
And some of them have lived in these camps ever since.
And they have. They were penniless. They were relying very soon afterwards. The UN had to get involved, and the UN ended up supporting them for years, and the countries, the Arab countries around were trying to support them, but they didn't have a lot of money to begin with, and so it was a terrible injustice that lasted for years, and a lot of these people lived the rest of their lives out in these tent cities, and maybe a few of their children snuck back,
Well, some of the people who'd been living, I think, in Jerusalem, say in the cities, or what became the cities, stayed. So
they were not as demolished as the villages. They would take the villages and level them, and then they would take all the street signs. You have no. One of the things that settler colonialists do is they they take away the culture of the people that they replace. And so they made sure that nobody knew what was the name of this town, this little village. After it was demolished, they take all the signs, they take all the records, and so nobody knew the place even existed.
But some people do. I heard on Democracy Now! Just a couple of weeks ago, they were interviewing a young man whose parents and grandparents had lived in a particular village, and he was making a documentary talking to the remaining people what they remembered about
Yes, I remember
their
that.
village. I unfortunately I don't remember the name of the young man,
No.
but it sounded like a very interesting movie. And he was, he's doing it now to bolster the notion that how long this has been going on and how really, really tough this has been for anybody who's a Palestinian to